Hello, welcome to Long Lost Friends. I'm Elizabeth Eve King, and today I am so thrilled to be talking to writer Peter Cawdron. Peter's an Australian science fiction writer specializing in making hard science fiction easy to understand and thoroughly enjoyable. He's written over 40 books. That's incredible. Welcome, Peter.
Hi, thank you for having me on MetaStellar, and greetings from Brisbane, Australia, where it's about 8 o'clock in the evening over here.
Yes, I'm in Barcelona, so it's only 12 noon. And unfortunately, our co-host, Andrea's in the States. She couldn't join us because it's like 3 in the morning.
Uh, okay.
She wanted to talk to you, but not that bad. So there's so much I want to talk to you about. One of the things I am curious about is what inspired you to first become a science fiction writer.
Yeah, well, I've always loved writing, and as I grew older, I developed a greater and greater appreciation for science and the role that science has had in forming the modern world and in really shaping our lives as almost an invisible force behind the scenes. And that's in terms of medicine and electronics and technology and all this sort of stuff. And my favorite science fiction author was Michael Crichton. And as I was reading his books, I started to notice a pattern. And this might be a little controversial, but I started to realize that he's not a science fiction writer. He's an anti science fiction writer. And this sort of sounds a bit strange at first, but if you think of something like Jurassic Park, where there's the great line, and it's in both the book and the movie, of course, that your scientists were so busy wondering if they could, they didn't stop to think if they should. And it's this sort of condemnation of the science behind Jurassic Park. And the reality is that science has a whole field and discipline of ethics, and whether it's in the medical realm or some of these other realms, when scientific proposals are put up, they have to pass an ethics standards committee. So it sort of misrepresented science to the public. And then as I got into more books, I started realizing that this was a common theme in his writing. Timeline, the bad guys are scientists. In Prey, the bad guys are scientists making nanobots. In State of Fear, uh, the it's an anti-climate change book. It's a book where the bad guys are those who are trying to stop climate change. In Next, technology is the bad guy. And I just started to reassess things, and I realized that a lot of the attitudes and a lot of the ideas that he had were sort of recycled from general culture, and then he was amplifying them and magnifying them. And I realized that, as a writer myself, I wanted to sort of have the opposite effect. I wanted to um, promote science and allow people to see just how extraordinary the times in which we live are. I'll give you an example. My daughter loves music, and we went along to a performance of Johann Sebastian Bach's pieces, and it was a wonderful evening. We're sitting in the audience and listening to all these pieces, and they arranged them chronologically as they had occurred in the life of Bach, which I thought was, that's quite interesting, because normally if you're going to hear a musical piece, it's just in isolation. And as they went through it, they were talking about the death of his children. He lost 10 children under the age of 5. And his first wife, died in childbirth. And it just, that's a level of grief and heartache and anguish that has just been erased from history for us. And it's not that long ago. We're not talking thousands of years, we're talking a couple of hundred. And so as a writer, I want to sort of make science the quiet hero in the background, or almost have science as another character, and sort of help restore some of the positive aspects of science, because it has been under attack. And of course, with things like the pandemic and misinformation, that's really become rife in these past few years. And so being able to write and to entertain is wonderful, but I do think there's also a bit of a social responsibility to, um, you know, keep science and fiction a little bit separate. Yeah. So I like to think that I'm writing science fiction with a focus on good science and good fiction without undermining science at the same time.
I think that's great. I think that's so important. What with all the anti-climate change and just, yeah, so much disinformation out there about how
Yeah.
science. Now, you include an extensive afterword in your books going into the science that's actually in the story and trying to make it more clear if people don't get it, which I think is wonderful personally. But I thought I'd ask you to speak about why you think that's important.
Yeah. Well,
So
I do get a lot of comments in reviews, and when people reach out to me, they'll say, "Oh, I was never sure quite what was science and what was fiction." And so I started developing these afterwards. And a lot of times the science can be quite surprising. It can really take people off guard where they don't quite realize that some of these scientific advances have happened. And one of the greatest compliments I can get in a review is that someone doesn't know where the science ends and the fiction starts. And so the afterword is an opportunity for them to see that and to reflect on the story and realize, oh, okay, that's actually accurate. And that point was accurate. And that was this one as well. And so to sort of see the science fiction in the context of good science.
now
So
I'm
that's kind of
curious.
fun.
Oh, I'm kind of curious. So do you get a story idea and then you look for the science, or do you look for this? How does that work?
That's a good question. I read a lot. Um, I also read quite broadly. So I think one danger for any writer, regardless of genre, is to become uh, blinkered and only seeing their own genre, because you pick up and magnify the bad habits in that genre. So I'll read broadly. One of the book I finished recently was a biography of Voltaire and his mistress from the 1700s. I've enjoyed John Green's Fault in Our Stars, An Abundance of Catherines, Paper Towns. So things that you perhaps wouldn't associate with someone who's writing about black holes and star clusters and things like this. But it allows me to sort of take the blinkers off and see what's done really well in other genres and look to sort of bring that into my own genre and avoid the tropes that are in my own sort of chosen genre. So to any writers out there, I would say, if you're a romance writer or you're a comedy or historical, you certainly have a love and a passion for those, but look to read beyond them, because that's where the real learning is going to be. And that's where you can sort of look at the craft. I enjoyed reading All the Light We Cannot See, Where the Crawdaddies Sing, things like this, where they're just beautifully written stories. And no lightsabers, no fast and light spaceships and rockets, and yet just beautiful insights into human nature.
And science,
So,
where the crawdads sing, actually.
yes, yes,
Yes.
yeah,
And she was a scientist.
yeah.
Anybody
And
who
there's,
look into her background, it's really interesting.
yeah, she had a huge background in biology and marine conservation, and she wove a lot of that into the story, and it was just magnificent in the way it was presented. So,
So
yeah.
do you ever, though, you're reading along and either you have an idea and you say, I'm going to look for the science, or you're reading along and you say, oh my God, that science is so incredible, I have to fashion a story around it.
So when I start a book, you have the beginning blurbs, copyright and all this sort of stuff. And the first thing I'll start is the afterword. So I'll have the basic ideas. And then as I'm reading around the story or researching the background, I'm sort of filling in the afterword and almost writing that before I'm writing the story itself, because I'm sort of seeing these little glimmers and ideas and insights and realizing, oh, that's the kernel of a great point in the story. I'll give you an example. So this is one I only learned a couple of days ago. There's a concept called Zeth's Law, and it relates to language. And essentially what it says is that words get used with a certain frequency in pretty much all languages. So regardless of language, whether it's Chinese, Japanese, Hindi, English, French, German, you have classes of words that occur really, really often, the, and, is. Then you get sort of the next tier down, which can be words like because or from. Then you'll get words the next tier down, which can be words like books or chair, table, furniture, things like this. And so you sort of get this ascending and descending structure. And Zeth's law sort of says, okay, well, what percentage of words in any given language is going to have this structure? And the fascinating thing about it is they applied Zeth's law to something that you and I wouldn't think of as a language. And that is the clicks of dolphins. So when dolphins, and what they realized is that it follows this same principle, that there's really, really common clicks, then there's a tier down that isn't used quite as much, and then there's a tier down again, which is much more infrequent. And so it suggests that dolphins are communicating with their own language. We just don't understand it. So that's quite profound. And the other thing that Zeth's law suggests is that if we were to get a signal from outer space, a long, complex signal, we could apply Zeth's law, and we might not understand the details there, but we would be able to say, is this just garbage? Is this just noise? Or is there actually patterns and structure? Because if we can see language between species, human to dolphin, even though we can't understand it, it actually suggests that we could see the same pattern between us and an extraterrestrial, where we might not understand the language, but we can start to realize that this is actually not noise, this is a real, genuine signal. So that'll work its way into a story. I'll start making notes in the afterword, and I'll start the wheels turning on how that could apply. And it's real science. It's real cutting edge insights that scientists have gleaned that can then form the basis of a story.
That sounds great. I keep thinking of So Long and Thanks for All the Fish. Yes. Yeah, okay.
Maybe that's what they're saying in the
right.
Zeth structure.
There's a study, you probably love this, so I have to mention it. Years ago, this guy just taped prairie dogs for decades. Did you hear this? And they have verbs, they have, yesterday, this guy in a red shirt was walking here. I mean, very specific language, which they need to because they're prey to everything. But yeah, we can. And I don't know, I mean, I don't remember Zeth's law being mentioned in the articles I read on it.
Well, see, that's taken it a step further, where they've been able to, by observation, recognize that this particular signal means red shirt, and because they can do that. With dolphins, we're not at that point where we can interpret it yet. But Zeth's law and detailed observations will get us to that. But it tells us it's possible, because it tells us that they are actually communicating. These aren't just random, it's not like a dog barking where it's just noise that's being produced. There's
we think it's
meaning.
Just noise, but maybe
well, Zeth's law suggests that those clicks and noises the dolphins are making actually communicate information. So it's quite fascinating.
Yeah, that's really, really interesting. I also find it different languages, the word use. I lived in Korea for a year, and the most common words in their language are please, thank you, excuse me, whereas ours are like and, a, the, and they were a little horrified.
Yeah, and that's a good example where Zev's law, we can't assume what those words are, but we can just see the pattern and we can see that there's intelligence being communicated, there's intent coming across.
So
So
are
it sort of
you
puts us on the first step.
so are you thinking about that in terms of signals from outer space? And do you believe there's life in outer space?
Oh, I had someone ask me this question on the beach this afternoon. um, the, the question of is there life in outer space is fascinating because we actually know the answer. And the answer is unequivocally yes. And the reason is because we're in outer space. And it might sound a bit uh, reductive, but it's actually a really good point when you stop and think about it. For all of human civilization, we've made this distinction between Earth and the sky. We've seen Earth as all encompassing, and then stars are just things out there. They're dots in the sky, there's moons, and we've seen this abstract separation. And of course, once science comes along and we start exploring space and developing telescopes and sending out satellites and things like this, we start to realize that actually our intuitive perspective is back to front. We're on a very small planet orbiting a rather average star in a nondescript galaxy that's one among around 400 billion galaxies in the observable universe. And so we've only got a sample size of one, that's us, but we are irrefutable proof that life can thrive in outer space. And so the question then becomes, well, is there any other life in outer space? And the answer to that is there's no reason not to think there is. In fact, the existence of Earth gives us a very good reason to think that there is going to be other forms of life because Earth is not this all-encompassing thing that we've sort of thought for thousands and thousands of years. I think we can now send the Voyager space probe off, and Carl Sagan famously lobbied to have it turn its camera back towards Earth. And a lot of the scientists at the time were concerned that it would burn out the camera. And he said, look, it's worth it. We're going to get this incredible view of Earth like it's never been seen before. And then there was just this tiny blue speck, this tiny pale blue dot in the moon, in the sunbeams. And of course, he then went on to talk about, everybody that has ever existed and every king and every philosopher and every artist, they've all lived in that one tiny dot. And that sort of puts us in perspective. That sort of gives us context in which to view ourselves in a much more accurate way. And it very much says, well, if it can happen here, there's really no reason it can't happen elsewhere. So I definitely think that science is going to continue exploring this, and I would expect that with a lot of the advances that we're making and a lot of the telescopes that are coming online at the moment and are scheduled to come online over the next decade, our chances of actually detecting life elsewhere is only going to increase. I read a quote by one of the chief scientists at SETI, and gosh, I'm trying to remember who it was. It wasn't Seth Shostak, but it was one of the other ones. And they made the point that if you look at the ocean as a point of comparison, and this is what I was telling these people at the beach, because we literally had the ocean right in front of us. And you were and that represents every star in the known universe. The amount of space that we have surveyed is about a bathtub by comparison. And so, to look in that bathtub and say, well, I don't see any evidence for whales. I don't see any evidence for dolphins. It's premature. And so the search just needs to be expanded and developed. And as our technology increases, I think we're going to find those whales. We're going to find those dolphins or their celestial equivalent. It's just a matter of time.
In fact, we're just exploring parts of the ocean now. There was just a recent article about certain seamounts where they've only now managed to start getting to the bottom and found all these forms of life they never imagined existed down there.
Yeah.
So yeah, and anybody who's a diver who's hasn't been near a coral reef, you can see there's just nothingness out there. It's terrifying, actually. And yeah, so look at space. That's a really interesting point. I love that. I love the fact that, yeah, life does exist in outer space. So
Yeah, we're it.
we're it that we know of, but there is bound to be more.
Yeah.
So you've been criticized sometimes for being political in your work. Do you care to talk about that? How do you feel about that critique, and why do you think that's important?
Yeah. It's interesting. I do think that I don't think that writing should be highly politicized, but I do also think that there's a place for fiction to be a mirror of society. And so we should address the concerns that arise in society. We shouldn't shy away from them. And the interesting thing is, if you look at books that have no politics, supposedly, they're really coming from a privileged position. They're written by people who have the ability to ignore the political problems that are going on. And so the absence of politics in a book is a political statement in itself. It says, I don't care. Doesn't affect me. Not my problem. So I think there's a place for it when it's organic, when it's contextual, it fits the flow of the story. And I don't think writers should be afraid of stepping on a few political landmines. I think the great debate, of course, in the US is between woke and anti-woke. And the thing that makes me laugh there is woke is very clear. It's about waking up to ethics, to equality, to compassion, to empathy. Anti-woke is a failure of imagination, because anti-woke really is asleep. You're either awake or you're asleep. And it's like, why don't they adopt asleep if they really want to take the opposite position to woke? And it's like, of course, nobody wants the implications of that. So they say, well, we're anti-woke, and it's a privileged position. And, by ignoring these things, and I'm in a position where I could ignore them. I'm the classic middle-aged white guy, So for me, it'd be very easy to just sit on the sidelines and go, well, I'll just write fiction and collect, royalty checks and things like this. But I think we have a duty and a responsibility to mirror, to provide a mirror to society and not ignore these things. I don't think a book should be a political treatise. If that's, if you want to write a political treatise, great, write one. But in the context of fiction, I think it's really important to take in that broader social context and not ignore it.
Plus, it makes the world real, and also, there's that classic follow the money. Well, the only people who don't have to think about that are people with money. So, so you're right. The only people who can ignore politics completely are a certain class and a certain privilege.
Yeah,
So that.
And it all comes down to how you see equality. If you see equality as bringing people up to the same level, there's no issue. if you see equality as being dragged down to someone else's level, well, that's that's the way a lot of people sort of see it, and it's the wrong mindset. Equality is, if you look at the history of the world, and I think it was Martin Luther King Jr. who said, the moral arc of history is long, but bends toward equality. I might be paraphrasing that a little bit, but we have, to me, it's utterly astounding that it's only in the last 100 years that 50% of the population have been able to vote, being women. I mean, that's astonishing when you think humanity's been around for, hundreds of thousands of years. Political systems have been around for thousands of years. The concept of democracies have been around for hundreds and hundreds of years. And yet half of the population was deliberately excluded.
And there's certainly still countries where women are not allowed to vote.
Exactly. So
thrive.
Yeah, and so fiction has an opportunity to raise questions and provide answers, and to get people to think, and to sort of challenge them to see things in a different light, and in a light that they may not have considered because perhaps they are more privileged. And so it's sort of it should be something that opens the eyes and removes the blinkers, rather than ignoring and just pretending nothing is wrong and everything's because everything's right for me, everything's fine. That's a mistake. So it's interesting to consider.
Yeah, and if you look back, Charles Dickens, Victor Hugo, Mark Twain, they all raise, important big questions and change things. Uncle Tom's Cabin here at Peter Stower. I mean, it changes. You can actually change the fiction. So thank you for doing that. That's an admirable thing.
That's a very good way of putting it.
Is it hard to make hard science fiction fun and accessible to non-science people?
Oh, great question. I hate the term hard science fiction. I know where it came from, and that because it does turn people off. People will look and go, I don't want to read something hard. So I try to describe myself as a plausible science fiction author. And I try to focus on characters. And it's one of the reasons I read outside the genre, because I don't want to be blinkered and just be, rock hard on the science and forgetting the characters, because I think, ultimately it's about humanity. We only ever get to experience one life. But as George R.R. Martin said in Game of Thrones, a reader lives 1,000 lives by reading 1,000 books. And that's really what books are about. It's about being able to experience something without actually ever living in that way.
Yeah, that's a great point. So anything you want to add before we wrap up this section?
Oh, just that to everyone that's watching the podcast, on behalf of myself and all authors, thank you for supporting writing. Thank you for supporting art. Like, I know you're an artist and a poet, because without readers, there are no writers. Without readers, there are no books. I often tell people when they're buying one of my books, I say, you're actually funding the next book. By buying this book, you're investing in the next book. You're giving me that opportunity, and it is a privilege, and it's something I don't take lightly. And yeah, it's on behalf of all writers. Thank you for giving us the opportunity to express ideas and sort of pull things together and structure them into novels. It's a real joy.
Yes, indeed. Thank you so much. And thank you so much for joining us. We always end with the best thing I learned this week. So my best thing, I didn't learn it this week. to be fair, but is that rats did not cause the Black Death. All the research is pointing to that. There's a number of articles you'll find. My favorite article, I think, was on Nautilus magazine, one of my favorite science magazines. Brilliant writing. I strongly recommend it. I'll put a link below. But apparently, based on the population of rats and the number of rat corpses and the number of humans, it's like not. And rats are given a really bad rap. They're very smart, clean creatures with interesting relationships. So this is my plug for rats.
Well, it's hundreds of years later, and that stigma is still attached to them, isn't it? So that's quite something.
It's horrible.
I'm probably going to butcher the pronunciation of this because, but I actually don't mind this. You know, when people mispronounce a word, often they feel embarrassed because they've only ever read the word, they've never heard it spoken out loud. But I think mispronouncing words is a sign of intelligence. It means you're pushing yourself beyond your natural bounds. You're not content with just what you know. You want to learn more. So the name of the creature I wanted to tell you and your viewers about is Christomelon squirumferum. But people can look at the link below if they doubt my pronunciation. But it's the sea pangolin, or the scaly-footed gastropod. This is a volcanic snail. So, and I find this quite fascinating that there's a snail that lives around the hydrothermal vents at the bottom of the Indian Ocean. So these snails, they're thriving 1.5 miles beneath the ocean. That's 8,000 feet or 2.5 kilometers. They're surviving under pressures of 25,000 kilopascals, or 240 times the pressure we feel at sea level. You know, when you dive underwater and your ears sort of go tight because the pressure's building up. Well, they're at 240 times what we experience. It's enough that it's twice the maximum depth of a nuclear submarine. You know, so and these things live down there in complete and utter darkness. But the most amazing thing about them is the temperature at which they live is 750 degrees Fahrenheit. That's 400 degrees Celsius. That's hotter than my oven. It's hot enough to melt lead. And these snails thrive in that environment. And what it tells us is that if life is tenacious enough to survive in such an extreme and hostile, inhospitable environment, what about elsewhere? You know, when we look for other planets in outer space, we tend to look for things that look like Earth, you know, and things that look like Hawaii. But here's something that lives in utter cold, utter darkness, hot enough to melt lead, enough pressure to destroy a submarine, and it just lives its life. And so that raises the question that raises the possibility that there could be similar kinds of life in places like the moons of Jupiter and Saturn, where similar sorts of pressures are possible and where there's sort of geothermal activity. And it also says that, you know, when we look at a planet through our telescopes, we're just getting a very limited view of it. You know, we can't see what's potentially living 1.5 miles beneath the ocean. There could well be creatures like this. We can look at a hellish world and we would just write it off and go, well, look, there's lava and things. And yet here on Earth, we have creatures that can thrive in those similar environments. So I think life is much more diverse and capable of thriving in extremes than perhaps we really appreciate. And over time, as we keep looking at the stars and keep looking at exoplanets and things like this, we'll find places where there's a potential for life, but it may not be life anything like what we've seen on Earth, or it may be life like what we see at the bottom of the ocean.
And in fact, you're making me think about slime molds, which anybody who hasn't looked into them should. They look like a slime mold, and then they form basically into a snail that moves around, and then they form basically into a sporing fungus. So we could see a slime mold on another planet and not think that is a life form. And these creatures, I mean, they predicted the path of the Tokyo subway when they were put in a maze. So
Yes.
they're amazing. And also, the beautiful word for those creatures like snails, extremophiles, which I
Yes.
love that word.
Yeah.
So thank
So we
you.
can't put life in a box. It's got much more diversity than what we sort of expect.
Yeah, thank you so much. You've given us so much to think about and to look forward to your next book. So, and thank you guys for listening. Please like this video, leave comments below, and subscribe to our channel. Hit the notification button so you don't miss any episodes. If you want to support our publication and help us produce more original content, stories, interviews, please support us on our Patreon page. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you, Peter.
Thanks for having me on MetaStellar. It's been great.